Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back in time where the ancient world unfolds before us like a papyrus scroll being gently unraveled. Tonight, as the modern world continues its hurried pace outside your window, we'll travel together to the banks of the Nile, where life moved to the rhythm of the great river's annual flood, and the blazing Egyptian sun marked the passing of days for people who lived thousands of years before our time. This historical journey is designed to help you unwind, to let the tensions of your day dissolve as we explore the lives of those who came long before us. The steady flow of history has a way of putting our own troubles into perspective, allowing our minds to drift peacefully toward rest and slumber. I'm always curious to know where in our wide world you're listening from. Perhaps you're settling in for the night, or maybe this tale accompanies your morning routine. Wherever you are and whatever time it is, in your corner of the world, I'd love for you to share in the comments below. It brings me such joy to see our community of history enthusiasts gathering from across the globe. If you find comfort in these historical journeys and wish to join me for future explorations of times long past, please consider subscribing. This way, you'll never miss a chance to step through the doorway of time and escape into another era when you need a moment of calm. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and digital screens of our modern existence. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to carry you back to the 16th century before the Common Era, to a small mud brick home on the outskirts of ancient Thebes, where the first light of dawn is just beginning to illuminate the life of a young Egyptian girl. The morning star still hung in the sky when Nefertari opened her eyes, knowing she must rise before the household stirred. At 14 years of age, she had long since learned that the day's water must be drawn before the sun transformed the air into a shimmering haze of heat. She slipped from her reed mat, careful not to disturb her younger sisters who slept nearby, their breathing soft and rhythmic in the pre-dawn quiet. The packed earth felt cool beneath her feet as she reached for her simple linen shift, the same one she had worn yesterday and would wear tomorrow, until the weekly washing day came around again. Outside, the Nile was a silver ribbon in the distance, already dotted with fishing boats whose occupants had risen even earlier than she. Nefertari lifted the heavy water jar onto her shoulder with practiced ease, her slender frame belying the strength she had developed through years of carrying water, grinding grain, and kneading bread dough. Another day begins, she whispered to herself, a small ritual that helped her gather her thoughts before the demands of the household fell upon her shoulders. The path to the communal well was one she could have walked blindfolded, having traversed it countless times since she was old enough to carry even the smallest of jars. As Nefertari returned with the water, she could hear her brothers stirring in their separate sleeping area. Amenhotep, who had seen 16 floods of the Nile, and Passer, just a year younger than Nefertari, were preparing for their day of learning. Their father, a mid-level scribe in the temple of Amun, had arranged for them to receive education befitting their station. "Hurry, Nefertari," her mother called from the cooking area where she was already kindling the morning fire. "Your brothers must eat before they leave for their lessons." Nefertari quickened her pace, knowing that her own day of domestic duties would not wait for her brother's departure. While her brothers ate their morning meal of bread and beer, discussing the texts they would study and the calculations they would practice, Nefertari began the daily task of grinding grain for the family's bread. The grinding stone was worn smooth from generations of women's hands, and as she pushed the heavy stone roller back and forth, she listened to her brothers' excited chatter about their futures. "Master Senenmut says I have a gift for numbers," Passer was saying proudly. "He believes I could become a tax assessor, or perhaps even an architect's assistant, if I continue to apply myself." Their father nodded approvingly, his eyes bright with the promise of his son's potential. No one remarked on Nefertari's potential, for what was there to remark upon? Her future was as fixed as the stars in their constellations. Marriage, children, household management. These were the boundaries of her world, defined not by her abilities or desires, but by the simple fact of her womanhood. As her brothers gathered their writing palettes and prepared to leave, their father gave them each a blessing. "Make me proud today," he said, touching their shoulders. Then he too departed, off to the temple where he would spend his day recording offerings and temple business, a world of words and power that Nefertari would never enter. With the men gone, the women's day truly began. Nefertari's mother, Iset, began instructing her in the preparation of kohl, the black eye paint that served both cosmetic and medicinal purposes. "Watch carefully," Iset said, grinding galena minerals into a fine powder. "Too coarse and it will irritate the eyes. Too fine and it will not adhere properly." The lead-based substance was mixed with animal fat to create a paste that would be applied around the eyes with a slender stick of wood or bone. "Beauty is not merely vanity," her mother explained, as she had many times before. "It is our duty to appear pleasing to the gods and to men. The eye of Horus protects us, and we honor it with our adornment." What her mother did not say, but what Nefertari had begun to understand, was how this beauty came at a price. Her eyes often stung and watered after application, and she had seen older women whose prolonged use of kohl had led to chronic irritation and sometimes worse afflictions. Yet to go without was unthinkable. A woman unadorned was considered slovenly, disrespectful to her household and to the social order itself. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher and the heat intensified, a commotion at the door announced the arrival of Nefertari's aunt, her father's sister, T. Unlike Nefertari's mother, Aunt T was a widow, her husband having died 3 years earlier from a wasting illness. "Sister," she greeted Iset with obvious distress in her voice, "I must ask for your husband's help. The grain merchant claims I still owe payment for last month's delivery, but I paid in full. Without a man to speak for me at the magistrate's hearing, I will surely lose what little I have left." Iset offered her sister-in-law cool water and sympathy, promising that her husband would assist when he returned. Nefertari listened quietly as she continued her work, understanding even at her young age the precarious position of her aunt. Without a husband, father, or adult son to represent her interests, Aunt T existed in a kind of legal limbo. Though she managed her household competently and had even continued her husband's small weaving business with skill, she could not speak for herself in any official capacity. The law did not recognize her voice, only her relation to men who were no longer present. As midday approached, Nefertari's mother beckoned her to prepare for an important visit. "The wife of Nacht the merchant is coming to discuss a matter with me," she said, her tone conveying the significance of this meeting, without explicitly stating its purpose. Nefertari knew what this meant. Marriage negotiations would soon begin. Though no one had spoken to her directly about it, she had overheard enough whispered conversations between her parents to understand that they were considering a match for her with the son of a prosperous grain merchant, a young man of 22 who had recently lost his first wife in childbirth. "We must appear our best," her mother instructed, retrieving a wooden box that contained their most precious possession, a wig made of human hair, reserved for special occasions. The process of preparing to wear it was elaborate and uncomfortable. First, Nefertari's head was shaved completely, a monthly ritual that helped prevent lice but left her scalp vulnerable to the harsh sun. Then, a thick layer of scented fat was applied to her bare head before the heavy wig could be positioned. "Sit straight," her mother admonished, as she adjusted the cumbersome headdress. "A woman of quality never shows discomfort." By the time the merchant's wife arrived, Nefertari was a picture of young Egyptian womanhood. Eyes lined with kohl, lips stained with red ochre, body fragrant with lotus-scented oils, and head crowned with an immaculate wig that felt like a weight of stone in the midday heat. She served the women cool drinks and sweet cakes, keeping her eyes downcast as was proper, while they discussed her as though she were not present. "She has good hips," the merchant's wife observed clinically, "and her mother has borne 5 children with 4 surviving, so fertility runs in the family. My son needs healthy sons quickly, after the disappointment of his first marriage." Nefertari's hands trembled slightly as she poured more drink, knowing that her future was being decided in this conversation. 12 was the common age for marriage, and at 14, some already considered her somewhat delayed. The prospect of being wed to a man she had never met, a widower still mourning his first wife, and immediately being expected to replace the child that had cost that woman her life. These thoughts swirled in her mind like chaff in the wind, but there was no question of refusal, no concept of choice in this matter. This was simply the way of things, as unchangeable as the flow of the Nile or the rising of the sun. Nefertari watched her father and the widower, Amenhotep, seal their agreement with a firm handshake. The bride price had been negotiated, modest but respectable, and within a month's time, she would leave her childhood home forever. Her mother squeezed her shoulder in what was meant to be reassurance, but Nefertari could see the worry behind her eyes. "You'll be a good wife," her mother whispered, "and may Taweret protect you when your time comes." The mention of the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth sent a chill through Nefertari's body. She had seen enough women in their neighborhood swell with child, heard their cries during difficult births, and witnessed too many funeral processions afterward. Just last season, her cousin Meritaten had died, bringing her second child into the world, the baby following her to the afterlife only days later. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Nefertari's mother and aunts instructed her in the duties of a wife, their voices lowered when speaking of the marriage bed. They prepared her small trousseau, linen garments, a wooden comb, a small copper mirror, and a few amulets for protection and fertility. On her wedding day, they adorned her with henna patterns on her hands and feet, applied fresh kohl around her eyes, and placed a garland of blue lotus flowers on her head. "Remember," her mother said as they walked toward her new home, "give him sons quickly. A woman's security lies in her children." What remained unspoken, but understood, was the other threat that loomed over every Egyptian wife, that her husband might bring another woman into the household if she failed to please him or bear children. Nefertari's first year of marriage proved difficult. Amenhotep was not cruel, but neither was he tender with his young bride. She learned to manage his household efficiently, directing the servants and overseeing the preparation of his meals. When she finally conceived, the women of the neighborhood brought her amulets of Taweret and Bes to protect her growing child. Her mother visited often, bringing herbal mixtures to ease her discomfort. "Pray to Hathor," she advised, placing a small figurine of the cow-headed goddess beside Nefertari's bed. "And remember, many women survive this journey." The words, meant to comfort, only reminded Nefertari of how many did not. When her time came, the midwife was summoned, an older woman who had delivered hundreds of babies in their district. The birth bricks were prepared, painted with images of divine mothers and healthy infants. Nefertari squatted upon them as generations of Egyptian women had done before her, gripping the hands of her mother and aunt as pain tore through her body. Hours passed in agony. The midwife frowned, muttering prayers to Taweret as she worked. "The baby is turned wrong," she finally announced, her weathered face grave. What followed was a desperate struggle that Nefertari would later remember only in fragments. The taste of bitter herbs forced between her lips, the midwife's arms reaching inside her, the sensation of being torn apart, and finally, mercifully, the cry of her son. You were fortunate, the midwife told her days later, when Nefertari could finally sit up without assistance. Many women with difficult births like yours join Osiris in the afterlife. Nefertari nodded weakly, cradling her son. She had survived, but the midwife had warned her that future births might be even more dangerous. When Amenhotep visited her sickbed, his eyes were warm with pride at his new son. But there was something else there too: calculation. "Rest well and regain your strength," he said, touching the baby's head. "We will need more sons to secure our household." Nefertari understood the unspoken threat. If she could not provide more children or did not survive another birth, he would simply acquire another wife. Indeed, this was the reality for many Egyptian women of means. In the wealthier home across the street, Nefertari knew that 3 wives lived under one roof. The first wife now relegated to managing the household while the younger wives shared the master's bed. Even queens were not exempt from this practice. The pharaoh maintained a royal harem, and while the great royal wife held the highest status, she constantly faced the threat of being overshadowed by a newer favorite who might bear a son first. For ordinary women like Nefertari, polygamy meant a precarious position, always at risk of being supplanted and losing what little security they had managed to attain. As Nefertari recovered and her son grew stronger, she began to observe the subtle ways women created space for themselves within these confines. Her neighbor Iset had become known for her skill with herbal remedies, drawing women from across the district to seek her advice for ailments their husbands' physicians could not cure. Through this knowledge, she had carved out a measure of respect and independence. Another woman, Satia, had secured a position as a musician in the Temple of Hathor, one of the few public roles available to women. Though still under the authority of male priests, her musical talent allowed her a life beyond household walls and a small income of her own. Most intriguing to Nefertari was her aunt Neferu, who had never married but instead had dedicated herself to service in the temple of Isis. As a priestess, she lived in temple quarters, participated in sacred rituals, and even administered temple properties. When she visited, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that Nefertari envied. "The goddess offers another path," Neferu told her once, when they were alone. "Not an easy one, but one with different freedoms." Such religious roles were rare, available only to women of certain social standing and connections, but they represented one of the few sanctioned alternatives to marriage and motherhood. For most women, however, resistance took more subtle forms. Nefertari watched her mother and other married women create networks of mutual support, sharing resources and information their husbands never knew about. They controlled the daily management of households, making small decisions that shaped family life. Some kept private stores of grain or valuables as insurance against hard times. Others became skilled at influencing their husbands' decisions through carefully timed suggestions. These were small rebellions, invisible to men who saw only obedience, but they represented the quiet agency women carved from a system designed to deny them power. As the years passed, Nefertari developed her own strategies. She became indispensable to Amenhotep by managing his household with exceptional skill and cultivating relationships with important families in their district. She learned to read and write hieratic script, a skill her brothers had been formally taught, but which she acquired through persistent questioning of a temple scribe who visited their home. This allowed her to keep household accounts without relying on others, giving her greater control over domestic resources. When Amenhotep mentioned taking a second wife after the difficult birth of their third child nearly killed her, Nefertari arranged for her younger sister to marry into a wealthy trading family instead, removing the most convenient option. The contrast between these everyday negotiations and the rare women who achieved true power in Egyptian society was stark. While Nefertari and women like her fought for small freedoms within rigid constraints, history recorded the exceptional few who broke through these barriers. Hatshepsut, who had ruled not as queen, but as pharaoh herself nearly 5 centuries earlier, wearing the false beard and royal regalia of male rulers. Nefertiti, whose beauty and influence had elevated her to unprecedented prominence beside her husband Akhenaten. These women were as distant from ordinary Egyptian women's lives as the stars, admired perhaps, but offering little practical example for daily existence. For every Hatshepsut who claimed the throne, millions of women like Nefertari lived and died within the narrow confines of their prescribed roles, valued primarily for their fertility, beauty, and domestic skills. Their stories were not carved into temple walls or preserved in royal tombs. Instead, they lived on only in the whispered advice passed from mother to daughter, in the small amulets clutched during childbirth, and in the quiet resilience that allowed them to find meaning and create legacy within a world that offered them few choices and little recognition. The morning sun cast long shadows across the temple courtyard as Nefertari accompanied her aunt Neferu to the sacred precinct of Isis. "Watch carefully," Neferu whispered, adjusting her white linen robe as they approached the inner sanctuary. "This is one of the few places where a woman's voice can rise above a whisper." The temple of Isis stood as a rare haven for women, seeking purpose beyond the household walls. As a chantress and minor priestess, Neferu had found a measure of respect that few Egyptian women ever experienced. Nefertari observed the sisterhood of women, moving with purpose through the columned halls, their voices raised in harmonious hymns to the goddess, their hands skilled in preparing offerings and sacred rituals that men could not perform. "Even here we serve at their pleasure," Neferu explained later as they sat in the shade of a sycamore tree, watching the high priest direct the day's ceremonies from his elevated position. The highest religious offices remain in male hands. We may sing to the goddess, prepare her garments, and tend her sacred spaces, but we cannot interpret her will or speak with her authority. Despite these limitations, Nefertari could see how her aunt carried herself differently within these walls. Her spine straighter, her gaze more direct, her words spoken with confidence that would seem improper in the streets outside. "For some of us," Neferu continued, "this is enough. To have purpose beyond bearing children and managing a household. To be valued for our minds and voices, even if only within these walls." Back in the confines of her own home, Nefertari began to recognize the subtle ways women carved out power within their prescribed boundaries. Her mother had always claimed illness prevented her from attending certain family gatherings with her husband's difficult relatives. Only now did Nefertari understand this as a carefully crafted excuse, deployed strategically over years. "Men may control the world outside our walls," her mother told her one evening, as they prepared medicinal herbs for a neighbor's feverish child. "But within them, we create our own small kingdoms." The herbal knowledge passed from mother to daughter represented another form of quiet authority, women healing and supporting one another through networks invisible to the men who nominally ruled their lives. Nefertari watched with growing awareness as the women in her community exchanged more than just remedies and recipes. Information flowed through these feminine channels, which officials could be bribed, which merchants gave fair prices, which husbands were cruel behind closed doors. "Knowledge is protection," an elderly neighbor explained as she taught Nefertari how to identify which grain would last longest in storage. "Men control the granaries, but women decide how the grain is used. These small decisions, what food appeared on the table, which household goods were repaired rather than replaced, how children were disciplined, accumulated into a form of power that operated beneath the notice of husbands and officials." As seasons passed and Nefertari's confidence in managing her household grew, she developed her own subtle strategies. She learned to present her ideas as questions, allowing Amenhotep to believe certain decisions were his own. She cultivated relationships with the wives of his business associates, gathering information that she casually mentioned during evening meals. When her husband returned home pleased with a particularly advantageous trade agreement, he never suspected it resulted from intelligence Nefertari had gleaned weeks earlier from the trader's wife during a weaving circle. "Your husband grows more prosperous each season," her mother observed with knowing eyes. "He must be very clever." Nefertari merely smiled, understanding now the unspoken language that passed between women who had mastered this delicate dance. The contrast between these hidden forms of influence and true power became starkly apparent during the annual festival celebrating the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. As the royal procession passed through Thebes, Nefertari glimpsed the royal women, adorned in gold and fine linen, their status evident in every gesture. Yet even these elite women remained largely defined by their relationships to powerful men. Only the memory of Hatshepsut, who had ruled as pharaoh herself nearly a century earlier, offered a different possibility. She wore the false beard and the double crown Nefertari's grandmother had told her as a child. She called herself king, not queen, and for 20 years Egypt prospered under her rule. Such exceptions only highlighted the rule. For every woman who managed to claim extraordinary power, countless others lived within the narrow confines of their predetermined roles. As Nefertari watched a nobleman's daughter being carried past in a curtained litter, destined for marriage to a man 3 times her age, she recognized the fundamental truth of womanhood in her world. Whether high-born or common, whether in palaces or mud-brick homes, Egyptian women existed primarily as extensions of men, as daughters and mothers, whose value lay in their beauty, fertility, and obedience. Yet standing in the crowd that day, holding her young son's hand while her second child grew within her womb, Nefertari felt a complex emotion that transcended simple resentment. There was pride in her mastery of the subtle arts of influence, satisfaction in the small kingdoms women built within their constraints, and a deep connection to the generations of women who had navigated these same waters before her. The stone monuments might bear the names of kings and high officials, but the fabric of daily life, the raising of children, the healing of the sick, the preparation of food, the maintenance of homes, this essential work that sustained all of Egypt rested primarily in female hands. "We may not rule from thrones," she whispered to her son, who was too young to understand. "But without us, there would be no Egypt for men to rule."